We're going to talk about browser security, what you can do to help protect yourself online. And that ties right in with another topic for today called Cushing. Yeah, you've heard of phishing and maybe smishing. This is Cushing, and it's a real problem right now. We're going to talk about browser security, what you can do to help protect yourself online. And that ties right in with another topic for today called Cushing. Yeah, you've heard of phishing and maybe smishing. This is Cushing, and it's a real problem right now. In this week's newsletter, I've got my featured step-by-step. We've been having those the last few weeks, and it's the whole idea behind it is to help you with your cybersecurity, whether you're a home user or a business user. This stuff's all free. It's in the newsletter. You can sign up for free at craigpeterson.com. I think you'll like it. But the browser security topic is something that's not really addressed a lot, and we've got some pretty good, pretty secure browsers out there by default. Particularly Firefox is good. Safari from Apple is very good. Chrome is okay. Microsoft Edge, not so good. Certainly not with your privacy, which is the same problem Google has. In fact, Microsoft Edge is Google Chrome under the hood. So the two share a lot of stuff about sucking up information about you. But there's things that you can do to not only protect your security, but protect your privacy when you are online. So in this week's newsletter, right at the very top, you'll see this article. And Karen and I have been writing these now for a few months anyways, just to try and help you guys out. And that's what it's about. So if you have topics you think I should cover, by all means, send me an email just to me@craigpeterson.com. Or if you are on my email list, just reply to any of the emails that I send out. And typically that's only one email a week that I send out, but just find an old one even, hit reply, and we'll be more than glad to answer them for you. So let's talk about safeguarding your online journey, which is the topic for this week, the main topic. Now, there's a few things that you can do just by default out of the box. One of the best things you can do, of course, is to get a really good DNS filter. There's a free one called OpenDNS. We use the commercial version of that, which is called Umbrella from Cisco. But, there's some things, we've talked about those before. But here are the steps you need to take while you are using a web browser. Your web browser can be used by the bad guys to do things like crypto mine, even to go so far as to access files on your computer, unbeknownst to you. It can be pretty bad what they're doing. And when we're talking about a business, we have to kind of multiply this by some factor because, frankly, businesses are in a little bit worse shape because we have multiple people trying to use the browsers going online. So the first thing, you guess right, is keep it up to date, right? And only use up-to-date browsers. Now, there's a lot of businesses that are using software that was designed to work exclusively with Microsoft Internet Explorer, also known as Internet Explorer. And Microsoft Internet Explorer is very insecure, and it was ridiculous for Microsoft to do what they did at all because they did not follow most of the standards. Now, they had the typical attitude, we're Microsoft, we don't care if that standard's been out there for years and everybody uses it, we're going to ignore that. And so when people and businesses were writing software for websites that used Internet Explorer specifically, they wrote software, this just blows my mind, that will only work with Internet Explorer. Well, now you got a problem because Internet Explorer, even Microsoft didn't like and got rid of, so they don't have it anymore. Then they came out with Edge, which was not their product, and then Edge again, which was, it's a typical thing with Microsoft, right? They call a whole bunch of products by the same name, although they are completely different products, and that always bothers me. Cisco's doing that right now with Umbrella. Umbrella used to be specifically about DNS and specifically about ransomware, and now they've expanded Umbrella to just cover all kinds of areas. Now, they've had a lot of functionality that I'd never seen before, filtering in the web and all kinds of stuff, which is great, and I love it for small businesses. But at the same time, I think it's confusing because you're using the same name again. So Microsoft Internet Explorer went through a lot of iterations, all of them bad, and people who are internet people really disliked it. So Microsoft got rid of it, came up with another one that they called Edge, and again, people didn't like it, and the internet didn't like it. So they just threw up their hands and said, well, okay, well, how about we just go ahead and use Chrome? And that's what they did. Just like underneath Chrome, pretty much all of the web browsers out there, I think Firefox is the only exception that comes to mind anyways, they all use WebKit from Apple. So way down in the bowels of the browser, you've got WebKit. On top of that, you've got the Chromium. And then on top of that, you've got Edge. So a lot of people with the fingers in that pie, and that also means you have to keep it up to date. Now, for those people who are still using Internet Explorer because of online or web applications that were designed specifically for it, I really, really want you to stop it. Just stop it, right? Don't use it anymore, please. If you can possibly avoid it, maybe download Firefox if you're running an older version of Windows, which you shouldn't be doing either. Use Firefox. That'll usually work with a lot of these different websites out there, so it's worth checking out. No two ways about it. Because if you're not using an up-to-date browser, you could be in trouble, because that's where these, again, the hackers, the hosers are trying to suck your data out, get passwords and get other things, and there just isn't enough security in it. Number 2, browser warnings. Now, this gets kind of difficult, and I mentioned this in my newsletter here. You click through on browser security and safeguarding your online, because a lot of times the bad guys have pop-ups that come up when you visit a site. And sometimes they use pop-unders so that when you close your window, hey, guess what? There it is. It's there. And man, you didn't know that you needed to update your Adobe Reader, your PDF software, or you needed to update something else, or like your Norton, because you didn't even have it on your computer. But they have these little pop-ups that really fooled a lot of people. Same thing happens on a Mac. If they detect you're on a Mac, they'll have a little pop-up that tries to sell you this anti-malware software for your Mac that you just don't need. So there are pop-ups that do come legitimately from your browser, and then there's all of these other ones that aren't legitimate, right? So if the browser alerts you that a web page you're about to visit is potentially hazardous, if it says, hey, there's a pop-up that I blocked, stop and think about it for a second. Did you do something that would require a pop-up? Now, I blame the developers of legitimate websites for this one. It just shouldn't happen, because when you're online and you are trying to figure out what to do, where to go, how to get there, right, all of that sort of stuff, sometimes you click on a link and you want it to open up a new tab or new page because it wants you to fill out something or get some more information. And instead of doing that, it'll use the same technology that the hosers are using, where the hosers are using these popovers that'll come up, and that popover is going to say, as I said, an update or whatever it might be. So when a website tries to do it legitimately, your browser, if you've got pop-ups blocked, which by default a lot of browsers have them blocked nowadays, if you have it blocked, what's going to happen is it's going to notify you, usually in the URL bar, that there was a pop-up that was blocked. And, frankly, that's a good thing, right? You want them blocked. And then you have to decide, well, was this legitimate or not? Did I take an action by clicking on something that might have required a pop-up to come up? Very good question, no? And the answer is likely no, you probably didn't. It's probably a bad guy. But you got to pay attention to those warnings and when it's saying a pop-up, because sometimes it is legitimate and you want to handle that. Now, a lot of these browsers are offering you the ability to manage your passwords for you. And they have also a login for the browser. And then once you're logged in, it's going to synchronize your extensions and your tabs and everything else between all of the machines. Apple does this automatically with your iPhone, iPad, and your Mac and the Safari browser, and does a pretty good job on that stuff. I'm a little leery about doing it anywhere with any browser. So watch out if you're thinking that you're going to turn on sync on your browser, because what could be happening is syncing of data that maybe you don't want to have somewhere else, right? So things like your browsing history, your bookmarks, your cached content, especially if you have a shared computer and it's trying to synchronize all of this stuff to another computer that, again, as I said, you probably don't want to have it on that other computer. Maybe you do. I don't know. You know, I'm not a mind reader. I guess I shouldn't try and be one. The next one, using robust passwords. Man, have we talked about that for a long time. But rather than relying on your browsers, I just mentioned, we really recommend investing in a dedicated password manager. My favorite, and the one that definitely works the best out there, is 1Password. It's the number 1 password. It is absolutely fantastic. Make sure you check it out and use that as opposed to the built-in password manager that comes with so many browsers nowadays. And 1Password integrates very, very nicely with your browsers. Okay, we're going to have a lot more about this. We're going to finish this up. We've also got step-by-step instructions that you can find there in the newsletter, craigpeterson.com/subscribe. We're reviewing some privacy settings, browser security, what you can do, what you should do, and I'm kind of explaining these things as we go along. Of course, this was in this week's free newsletter that went out to everyone that's on my insiders list. Well, next up is plugins and extensions. These are kind of a mixed bag. I have recommended some before, one in particular that I'm thinking of that I'm not going to name, because it was, in fact, purchased by a company that ended up using it for evil. So it was a really great extension. It's cut back on the amount of memory your browser used and automatically suspended tabs and things. And then it went evil, full on evil, which was just a crying shame. Well, obviously, when you get down to it. So you got to be careful with browser extensions and plugins. I know a lot of them are neat. 10 plus years ago, a lot of people were putting in these little menu bars that went up on the top of your browser, and it gave you information on your stocks or your favorite sports team, and maybe it gave you a little search bar, all of that stuff all integrated right there in your web browser. And those were dangerous. A lot of them turned out to be siphoning information about you. Now, there's this line between privacy and security, and obviously privacy is important because, frankly, privacy is what leads to security. The more information that the hosers have about you, the more likely they are to be able to come after you and start stealing money from you, just sucking it right out of your bank account. That's why we call them hosers around here, isn't it? So only use approved plugins. So that's kind of the first rule. Now, again, the plugin I'm talking about right now that went evil was an approved plugin. It was in the Google Chrome store, and it was something that was really, really handy. So you got to be careful. Don't use third-party plugins that are not in the store for the browser. Absolutely don't, okay? That's rule number one. Unless it's for me. I don't have any plugins or extensions, right? This is the same thing, a plugin and extension. The other thing to kind of keep in mind is that even though a plugin or an extension might be in the official store, it doesn't mean that it isn't a problem where it's sucking up some of your data. Now, your browsers also can have what are called privacy modes. Chrome calls it an incognito window. Safari calls it, I think, a private window. I'm not sure what Edge calls it, right? They all call it slightly different things. What those windows are for is to stop the websites that you're going to inside that window from being able to track you. They do not have access to things like your cookies that might have been set in the browser from another site or maybe from this site. And when you exit that window, usually that privacy window kind of wipes things for you, gets rid of history, cookies that might have been saved, right? Your computer can be used to save information for the website. All of that stuff is usually just fine. Right, cookies, there's nothing wrong with cookies inherently. There's nothing wrong with a website storing a small amount of data on your computer inherently. In fact, it happens no matter what website you go to because you're going to be downloading graphics, preloading graphics, depending on the browser you're using. Graphics you don't even see can be preloaded onto your computer. So there's a lot of stuff that can be done on your behalf without your knowledge that actually loads things onto your computer. So using these privacy modes in the browsers can clear a lot of that stuff up, right? Now, remember, though, that even though it might clear it off of your computer and not let the website see what other sites you might have been to or what you've been searching for or whatever it might be, which I find annoying when they do that at the very least, but it does not conceal any of the activities that you are doing with your browser. So if you go to the bank, for instance, in a private web browser window, that's a good idea because you don't want that banking information to be available to the hosers. Right, if they know you're using Bank of America, for instance, they can then craft a special phishing email to fool you into thinking that, yeah, this is Bank of America reaching out to you and we need you to do thus and such, right? So it can be a real problem. So use the private windows. I've taken to using them a lot. I'll open my Safari browser, and when I'm going to anything really now, because I do a lot of work for different clients, as you can imagine, right? Different businesses. And so I use a completely separate browser window for each one of those sites that I go to. And I will go ahead and I'll use what Safari calls a private window in order to help block cookie transfer. So I'll be logged into Microsoft, for instance, maybe an admin or an Exchange or even an Outlook browser window, and I will have different ones open for different clients as I'm doing things, and then I close them when I'm done. Because there's also a cross-contamination potential problem, and in fact, Microsoft had that with some Chinese bad guys getting into a number of different accounts. So there are some limits to privacy mode, but remember, it doesn't really conceal your activities from the website you're visiting, obviously, because then they wouldn't work, right? It's not going to conceal your activities from your employer if you're at work and using your browser and work time to check up on your kid's soccer game or whatever it might be, right? Law enforcement officials, it's not. There are ways to recover the data from when you're using private browser windows, but it does help keep the data private from other websites that are trying to get access to it, okay? Live chat, it's a big problem because many times we are very trusting of other people, right? Most people are trusting of others, right? If you like big government, you're not trusting of anybody. If you don't like big government, then you are trusting of people. That's kind of the general rule, right? And if you disagree with that, I'd love to hear from you what you had to say about that sort of thing. But we trust people when we're online and we're in a live chat. We've talked before about some of the hosers that try and get you to, again, do things against your interest, buy these cards for Amazon, gift cards, or other places, and give them all that information. But you never really know who you are chatting with, and you also don't know who else is watching. So keep that in mind when you're chatting online, even with a secure chatting program. You want to keep an eye out also for remote control, because sometimes some websites out there can try and hack into your computer. They'll display this fake security alert on your browser. They'll say something like, oh, there's an infection on your browser, there's malware, a virus. And if you engage with these online helpers who are there just to help you and to get rid of that, my father fell for one of these things where they were pretending they were Microsoft. And yeah, you got to fix that, right? But they might pressure you into installing a remote agent, which is what happened with my dad, claim that they're fixing the issue, which of course they weren't. And in truth, your computer's just fine. They want to get malicious software. They want to get files off of your computer. And in my dad's case, he was keeping his user accounts, passwords, bank account numbers in an Excel spreadsheet. Yeah, okay. And then last tip here, log out of your browser when you're not using it. And I've got step-by-step instructions as well. You'll find those in this week's newsletter or online at craigpeterson.com. Make sure you subscribe and you'll get it all. Cushing is on the rise, so we're going to talk about that right now. We'll start with explaining a little bit about what phishing is, spearfishing is. There are lots of ways they are trying to trick you out there. So let's stop the hosers right now, because Cushing is a problem. I've had a few people ask me what I'm talking about when I say hosers. It's an old Canadian expression that goes back to really the Dust Bowl. And there were people on the prairies who were going around and sucking gasoline out of other people's cars and trucks. A lot of them were Dust Bowl farmers who just didn't have anything, didn't have any money. So they were called hosers because they were sucking the gas and the profits out of farmers' little vehicles back in the day. And that's why I'm calling these guys hosers, because they are trying to suck away your hard-earned money, your life savings in some cases, your operating account if you're a business, or maybe even more than just the operating account, in order to really kind of teach you a lesson, right? Because you rich Americans, you can afford it. And when in reality, man, it's tough. It's tough over here. I wish we had stronger, really family units that we could really rely on. I'm lucky enough to have a bunch of kids, a wife we've been married forever, and, I know we'll be fine for decades to come, but a lot of people, that's not the case. And, man, these bad guys have just been hosing it out of all kinds of people. It's such a shame. So let's talk about their latest strategy. Phishing is where they are just like fishing, right? They cast a wide net. They'll send emails out to hundreds of thousands of people, hoping they'll respond. Oftentimes it's an email talking about the bank. Right now they've moved more into the spearfishing category, and that is where they know you, your name, your email address, and they know where you work, they know where you live, they know your approximate salary. All of this information, believe it or not, they know. So they'll send you an email that's directed at you. One of the phishing emails I've seen recently that actually hit two of my clients that clicked on these things, and that is, it looks like it's from DocuSign. And so people just, click on it. Yeah, okay. And you sign into DocuSign and you start getting all your stuff together. In reality, that's not what's going on. It really isn't DocuSign. So you got to be very careful with those, by the way. And you can usually tell the fake DocuSign emails I've seen recently have had a from address that isn't really DocuSign. So if you'll just look at the from address, you'll usually be able to catch it, right? So it's easy enough for a lot of the filter software to pick up on some of this. I have clients that, for instance, are using Microsoft's email services. But in front of Microsoft's email services, we're running a Cisco enhanced email gateway that provides a lot more security. So it goes through our Cisco software, then it goes through the Microsoft software, and it catches pretty much everything because it looks at the links. And it says, where is this link going? And if it doesn't know, it'll actually go to the website and have a poke around the website, see if it looks malicious or not. And with the Cisco email gateway, we're talking about billions of these data points that it gathers every day to figure out which sites are good, which sites are bad. So you can catch a lot of times these phishing and spearfishing emails just by having really good email security. And let me tell you, Microsoft is not enough. I don't know if you've seen any news lately, if you follow closely the information technology news that's out there, but Microsoft is terrible. They just got lambasted for their almost complete lack of security for their email and for so many other things. And we've known Microsoft has been weak on security for a very long time. They've been pulling up their socks, but even Congress now is jumping all over them for their terrible security. So they're not that great, which is why we stacked Cisco on top of it, which is much, 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 much better. So we know that Microsoft can certainly look at links. Cisco definitely looks at the links. They grade the site. They determine if this link is a valid one, if it's a phishing email that you shouldn't click on. Okay, that makes sense. And then it's never delivered to you, right? It tells you, hey, this is not something that you should be really playing with. Thank you very much. And it just removes it out of your mailbox. In fact, the Cisco stuff can go into your mailbox after it's even been delivered and retrospectively pull it out of that mailbox. It's just amazing what they do. Now, how can the bad guys get around that? Well, they have found a way. We have smartphones with us all of the time. And on those smartphones are cameras. And the cameras now are amazing at being able to pick up QR codes. So I was at a museum here a couple of months back, and sure enough, each little display exhibit had QR codes, and you could put your camera on and point it at the QR code, and underneath it would have a URL. You click on that, and it opens the URL for you. Very, very cool, right? And a lot of them are shortened URLs. There might be bit.ly URLs, so you don't really know where it's going to end up taking you. But yeah, it's the museum. You kind of trusted it. Well, that QR code is how the bad guys are now getting around some of this cybersecurity. They are doing what's called Cushing. They're sending QR codes in email that if you scan them with your phone, for instance, it's going to take your smartphone to a bad site where they can hose money out of you. That's the idea, right? In some cases, they end up using your browser to do Bitcoin mining and other things, right? Cryptocurrency mining. But yeah, it's a real problem because how do you filter that if you are an email filter? Because it's not a link. The QR code doesn't have a link on it. The QR code's link is the code itself, and it's only visible. So some of the more advanced email software is now, when it's looking through your emails, it's looking for QR codes and deciphering them just like it would if you took a picture of it, for instance, and deciphered the QR code into a URL, and then it examines the URL to see if it looks like it is malicious. So we got to be careful here. This attack is kind of relatively new. I've seen it for a couple of years, but it includes links to simple things like advertisements, right? Commercial tracking, augmented reality. I've used a couple of those QRs before. They're really quite cool. But it's the link's destination that's the problem. You're scanning the barcode as it were, this square QR code, and it's taking you somewhere. And it's been very, very successful. So here are some tips on preventing Cushing attacks. That's what they're called, Q-U-I-S-H-I-G as in QR, Cushing. Never scan a QR code from an unfamiliar source. Even in the museum that I was in, I was checking to make sure that QR code was part of the display and wasn't something like a sticker that somebody had slammed on, right? If you get a QR code from a trusted source on email, confirm it separately, send a text message to the person, call them, make sure that QR is legitimate. Look for hallmarks of phishing campaigns, because this is the same as any phishing. They try and put in a false sense of urgency or appealing to your emotion. So be very careful. This is a big deal, and it's happening more and more. Cushing. Avoid those QR codes, but go right now to CraigPeterson.com. Well, we already know that the government has been carefully crafting its messages, particularly lately, to try and get us to buy into various types of, opportunities for them to make money, or at least for the politicians. So one of the big things that they've been doing, of course, is getting people to buy electric cars, scaring the living daylights out of the car manufacturers so that they'll make electric cars. And we've gone through before how, in fact, these electric cars don't even become carbon neutral until they hit about 70,000 miles. And most of them will never hit 70,000 miles. And we talked about that, and we talked about why with the leasing of these electric cars, et cetera, right? So there's real problems with it. Plus, of course, it's just plain not green electric cars because of all of the mining that has to happen for it. Much greener overall for the environment worldwide to drive a petroleum-based vehicle. So they're out there promoting these electric cars and various other things, trying to get rid of our gas stoves and gas furnaces and our gas, our LP powered barbecues and all of this stuff, because of course, carbon, right? And carbon, one of the most abundant anything in the universe, right? It's what is it? Hydrogen, yeah, is number one, I think it is. But anyways, it's way up there, very, very common. So they say, well, we've got to get rid of it because of, global warming, cooling, climate change, right? In summertime, it's heat. Wintertime, it's cold. All of it blamed on climate change. Well, you know what? Climate change is real. It is absolutely 100% real. No question in my mind. It has been one of the only constants throughout the history of the Earth and the universe is change, right? Climate change. The Earth used to be a lot warmer than it is now. When we had jungles in the Sahara Desert and jungles, frankly, up in Siberia, and even the North Pole shows all kinds of vegetation that had been there over the years. That's climate change, isn't it? It's just constantly changing. The question has to come down to what is the cause? And I bet you we will know with an absolute surety in about 1,000 years. Right? Maybe not even then. Maybe it'll take 1,000,000 years, because you have to see the cycles. It's only been, 25, I think it is. We're in solar cycle number 25 right now. That means we only figured out the solar cycles in the 1700s. because they figured out, oh, there's this gross solar cycle of an 11-year cycle. And every 11 years, right at the right part of that cycle, there's all kinds of stuff heading out from the sun, and it's knocking out our satellites, and our communications go down and causes all kinds of problems. We usually lose a satellite or two every 11 years as part of that solar cycle. Okay, great. So after 200 years, we've kind of got an idea of the solar cycle and what it's doing. Of course, the sun emits a whole lot more than just visible light or ultraviolet light or, right, the UV light that you have to block, right? That's what is potentially causing skin cancers and things. But we don't know everything about that solar cycle. We know very little about it. So you have the sun's influence, there's no question about that, in the temperature of the earth, right? The sun comes up in the morning, it gets warmer, it goes down at night, it gets cooler, right? There's at least that influence. But there are probably hundreds or thousands of other things that are also influencing the temperatures here on Earth. And this was an interesting article that I included in the newsletter this last week, and that is an underwater mega volcano. Now, if you know much about the Earth, we've got, of course, protection from many of the sun's most harmful rays by our magnetosphere. It's a big electric magnetic field that surrounds the Earth, and that's created, we think, because of the rotating molten iron towards the center of the Earth, and that creates this magnetic force, and that's what we're also using to have a magnetic North Pole versus the hard real North Pole. So, when you have one of those wonderful little compasses and it's pointing north, well, it's not really pointing north, it's pointing to the North Pole of the magnet that is our Earth. We also know that every, 50,000 years, 100,000 years, that magnetic pole shifts. It moves around. The reason we know that is we can look at some of the strata, some of the layers of the Earth, some of the rock formations, particularly iron, and look at how it lined up. Just like if you take a magnet, put it under a piece of paper, and you put a bunch of little metal shavings on top. I remember doing this as a kid. It was really cool. You can move those shavings around. You can see the magnetic pattern based on what kind of magnet you have. I had a horseshoe magnet, a couple of them, in fact, when I was a kid. I just thought those are so cool. And those magnets, of course, leave that pattern on the paper based on those metal shavings that you put on the paper. Well, that's how we know that the magnetic north and south poles of the Earth move around. And in fact, it looks like they kind of switch, and they switch fairly quickly. North Pole becomes South Pole, vice versa. The North Pole moves around. It was in North Africa. It's been all over the place. That's changing. Why is that changing? Well, we don't really know. We think, well, it's because of the molten iron again that's somewhere down under our feet. We've recently discovered, like in the last few months I was reading this article, that there is more water under the crust of the Earth than there is on the crust of the Earth. What? Water underground? Well, of course, we know that there is water underground, right? That's why we drill wells. But there's even more than we ever thought. So what do you think is going to happen when you've got all of the stuff in the center of the Earth moving around, that they say, well, Mars's core isn't really moving much, so that's part of the reason why it's colder. That's part of the reason why you don't have the volcanic activity. But we do. And how much of an impact does that have? How much of an impact do you think this supervolcano or megavolcano that was under the Pacific Ocean, that it erupted in early 2022, how much do you think that might influence things? Because it threw into the stratosphere millions and millions of gallons of water, vapor. And water vapor is definitely has a greenhouse effect. Obviously, it's not a greenhouse gas. I guess you could call vapor a gas, right? But a huge, huge amount thrown into the atmosphere. Surprise, a greenhouse gas coming from an underwater volcano, megavolcano, that I had never heard of before. But sure enough, I found an article about this in American Thinker, and I followed that through to NASA's website, a deep link into NASA's website, where they're talking about this underwater megavolcano and how that increased the temperature around the world. In fact, it was so strong, it sent a shock wave that went around the Earth twice, created a tsunami as well, a tidal wave. It was huge. And then you, of course, not only have the effect of it blasting up and blasting all of that water into the atmosphere, which becomes water vapor, which comes down as heavy rains, you noticed rains and things, right? And all the moisture in the air. But it also has the effect of warming the ocean. And it had enough of an effect that it was a measurable warning. So when we're talking about having a warmer summer than usual, right? This stuff about, it's the warmest summer ever. It's just, they're full of it. It is not even close. It's one of the warmest that we've ever measured. However, here's another thing that came out, and that is that these temperature stations have been measured and monitored for over 100 years now. And you might have seen these before. They're white. They sit up on stilts above grass, and they've got vents on the side so that the air can move through them. And then they have temperature gauges inside. Well, that was true 100 years ago, but today they haven't moved them, right? Because they want to have a sample, same place, so that they can tell if the air is warming, if the Earth is warming or cooling, or if it's cooling in that area or warming in that area. Well, part of the problem is now the latest research that I saw on these weather stations, temperature stations, shows that close to 98% of them are no longer sitting by themselves in an island of grass. They're now sitting, some of them, on top of tarmac, on top of black asphalt. Some of them are sitting right in the outgoing vents from air conditioners. You ever stood in front of an air conditioner outside where it is blowing the hot air, right? How hot is that? And we have temperature stations measuring the temperature now on top of hot asphalt and on top of or right beside the vents coming out from air conditioning from buildings. So they say, we've adjusted for that. NOAA says, we've adjusted for that. And, how do they know? It's like what I was just saying. Maybe 1,000 years from now, maybe 1,000,000 years from now, we will understand these processes much better than we have ever understood them before. But there are so many variables, it's crazy. And it reminds me of this whole scare with COVID. Do you remember coming out of the UK that there was a scientist who said, oh my gosh, this whole COVID thing, and there's going to be 2.5 million deaths from COVID. And we've got the formulas to prove it, right? We've created a model, this one guy in particular. And it turns out that the model was majorly wrong. In fact, the source code was eventually released, and it's what we in the biz call spaghetti code. It was terrible. They shouldn't use it to predict anything. And yet our lives are now being governed by what can at best be called spaghetti code surrounded by guesses. It's crazy. Hey, get this week's newsletter. Get all future newsletters absolutely for free. CraigPeterson.com/subscribe. Don't get hooked. At least that's the theme of this week's show. There is a lot going on in the phishing world. We've talked recently about social media and what's going on there. Well, I've got some real-world examples of what to do. People who get my newsletter every week, you should have noticed in there my very first article. I've been doing this now for a few months. My wife got on me to do it, but she's helped a lot, and we have been doing it every week. It's my featured tip. And this week, this is, of course, the theme is Don't Get Hooked, Essential Tips to Shield Yourself from Phishing Attacks. Now, I understand some of you guys don't want to sign up for a newsletter because you already get too much stuff. This isn't a newsletter. This is my insider show notes. And technically, I guess it's a newsletter. But in reality, what I'm doing here is finding the most important articles of the week. It's usually 6 to 8 of them, and putting them into my insider show notes. And I send it off to the various radio stations that I appear on. Some of them carry my regular radio show. Some of them do not. But you can get all of this without subscribing if that's what you want to do. If you really, really, really don't want to get my insider show notes every week, then don't subscribe. But here's what you can do. Go to my website. Now, the problem is if you don't get the email, you might not remember. But if you go to craigpeterson.com, you'll see on my homepage, it's divided into 2 sections. And the sections have, first of all, my podcast. So you can listen to my shows. It's right there. And I appreciate you guys listening to it. And you can also subscribe there. But that's the first part. The second part is called The Latest. And this is the latest articles that I've written. So what I just referred to, which is my featured tip of the week, those are all right there. So it's about halfway down the screen. You'll see it right there. And what you should look at in conjunction with this week's show is the Don't Get Hooked. And I've got a picture of a phishing hook going through a piece of email. And if you're wondering what that looks like, well, you'll be able to tell when you get there. And then I also have another one that I wrote called Don't Take the Bait, Unmasking Phishing Scams Targeting Small Businesses and How to Fight Back. So if you're a small business owner or someone working there, this is something that you're going to want to pay attention to. So let's get into the Don't Get Hooked article that I have up there. The FBI is estimating that phishing scams now have cost businesses and consumers over $12 billion in the last 5 years. That's almost real money. It's certainly not to Congress, but it is to you and to me, right? In 2018 alone, the FBI received over 2.2 million complaints about phishing scams, with losses totaling over $1.2 billion. And they have a special website set up that you can go to report some of these scams. And I got to tell you that in reality, they don't pay a whole lot of attention to most of these reports, because unless it's at least $20,000 that you've lost, they don't pay much attention to it. And that's from personal experience helping people out, listeners to the show that have been scammed. Now, what should you be doing? Be very wary, and I think most of you guys are, right? You're pretty cautious, but be very, very cautious if a website is asking you for any sort of personal information. A lot of them are asking for your email addresses, and in fact, you can't get around that. They absolutely require it, and that is such a problem, because once you're giving them your email address, that's kind of the key to the front door, or maybe it's the key to the screen door on your house, depending on how you want to look at this thing. But once they have that key and they're able to open that first door, the second door gets easier to get through. A lot of websites do this the right way. And the right way is let you create a user ID. Don't worry at all about your email address, at least not initially for that initial sign up. It's worth pointing out that these passwords that we have, our email addresses, etc., are often stolen by the bad guys. And that's part of the reason that it makes a lot of sense to try and change up your email address every once in a while. And obviously, do not use the same password on every website, because that can really nail you as well. So what is phishing? It's really, think of it as a scam. And what it's trying to do is get you to do something against your own best, worth the best for you interests. So it might be trying to get you to click on a link, and then that link's going to download malware, and then that malware is going to actually be ransomware, and then they're going to steal your data, then they're going to encrypt it, and then they're going to tell you that if you don't pay extra, they are going to release your own personal data. Those are all big problems. And it's not as obvious as the Nigerian scams. You might remember those pretty clearly, because with the Nigerian scams, you would get an email that was just terribly worded, and it's usually some Nigerian prince or princess that needs access to your U.S. bank account in order to run money through, and they'll go ahead and they'll make sure that you can keep some of that money that they're going to transfer through your account. These things nowadays are much harder to detect, and they're not just showing up in your email box. These phishing scams are now showing up in text messages and elsewhere. I had a listener who contacted me saying, hey, Craig, what do you think is happening here? And it was a scam. It looked very, very legitimate. I've had, in fact, quite a few that have contacted me. I had a lady who works for me whose friend had sent her a text saying that she had been kidnapped and was being held for ransom. And she needed to pay up and transfer this money. I think actually in her case it was, you need to go and buy a gift card, and tell us the number on the front of the card, and just scratch it off on the back and tell us that number as well, or we're not going to release your friend. And she had the presence of mind to go ahead and make a phone call to her friend, who said, I'm fine, I don't know what's going on here, because the bad guys had faked the address, which is the phone number of her friend's phone. So it looked like it was coming from her friend, but it wasn't, was it? So that gets to be a problem too, because when we are under stress, when something's happening like that, we don't think straight, and we're making all kinds of mistakes when we have it happen. So the bad guys are just playing all of these games, psychological games. And the grammar that they're using isn't as bad as it used to be, thanks to AI that's out there. So here's what you should do. If you think you might have received an email that is potentially from a bad guy, look at the email address and look at it really, really carefully. It's some of the scams out there, like the one that Barbara Cochran's person fell for, had a one-letter difference in the email address. So look at it. It might be, Craig at CraigPeterson.com. That's probably me. But how about Craig Peter S0N? Are you going to notice the difference? Same thing with banks, etc. Sometimes they'll put a dash in the middle, or they'll make it look like they've got a bank name or Apple or Microsoft in there. My dad fell for one of those scams as well, and the bad guys got his Excel spreadsheet that had all of his banking information in it, all of his passwords in it. And I had warned him about that in the past, okay? Look at the content, because sometimes there still are spelling and grammatical errors. There might be some really weird formatting, or just very, very generic greetings, or greetings that we don't use over here on this side of the pond. Legitimate companies usually proofread the emails. They'll use personalized greetings, and it'll be hi, or just your name, Craig, comma, and off they go. That's, in fact, how my emails come out. That insider show notes I was talking about earlier, that's how that shows up for you. Check for suspicious links. Now, an easy way to do that is usually to just hover your mouse over top of the link. and it'll show you down at the bottom left-hand corner of your browser window the actual URL that you'll be sent to. Now, there are some ways around that, so you got to be kind of careful. A lot of businesses have special email link checkers, so when the email comes through the business email server, it automatically says, hey, wait a minute, what is this? It double checks it, checks the reputation of the website, of the link, and hopefully keeps you safe and warns you about it. Verify the information. I like to just contact the company directly. So if I get an email from the bank, I'm not just about to hit respond or call the phone number that they've given me. I'm going to look up the bank's phone number. The way I do that, you look at the back of your debit card or credit card, and you'll see right there a phone number that you can call if you have questions. So do it that way. Don't just hit reply or call the number they gave you. One of the dead giveaways is urgency. It will seem like, oh, you've got to respond right away. They're trying to trick you into taking action quickly. Why? Well, because, as I mentioned, when your brain isn't working quite well as it should because you're under stress, you're going to make mistakes. So check for urgency. That's another sign that might be a bad guy in a phishing email. Make sure you sign up right now, craigpeterson.com/subscribe. Get those insider show notes and my tips for free. We've got a couple more tips here about phishing, and we're going to tell you what to do if you've been a victim of a phishing scam. Not just received a phishing email, but you've actually had money stolen from you or from your account. And then we're going to get into something I've never seen before. I have all of this information on my website if you go there, craigpeterson.com. Now, I'm reminding you of that because I'm not going to give you the phone numbers of what to call. You can find them on my website. Just hit that search button if you don't see them on the homepage, and you can find it. It's a pretty good search feature, and you will get to the right places. Now, I want to really emphasize this because this happened to my father. He was trying to get some help with his Microsoft computer. It was misbehaving. So he looks up on Google, Microsoft Assistance, support, and he calls the people up. And the first thing they ask for is a credit card. Now, that's not necessarily a bad thing. It's the last thing I ever ask for. I guess, it's because I'm much less of a great businessman as I am a kind of a tech guy. But he gave them the credit card and gave them full access to the machine. And so my stepmother was looking over his shoulder at the time this was all going on, and she saw them opening up his spreadsheet that had all of that information in it. It had his bank account numbers, passwords, everything right there. Obviously a huge problem. So she called me up and got my son on it, and right away got that thing fixed and shut them down. Well, how did he get into this trouble? By going to Google and finding Microsoft support. That's why I want you to go, if this happens to you, if you become a victim of phishing, I want you to go to craigpeterson.com and hit the search button and type in phishing, which is spelled, of course, Phishing, and then you'll find I have a few articles up there about it, and I have direct links on where to report some of this fraud. So the first place is the Federal Trade Commission. That's the first one I have listed here. This is a government agency that's supposed to protect consumers from fraud and scams, and boy, howdy, I've dealt with them before, and I have not been impressed. But that's the first place you go. It's reportfraud.ftc.gov. Then there's another one that's kind of interesting. It's called the Anti-Phishing Working Group. This is a nonprofit organization that's working to combat phishing attacks. So they will take phishing scam information. It'll do a lot better with those guys than it will with the Federal Trade Commission. Obviously, if you've had money stolen, then you got another problem, right? Then the last one that you can go to, and this is a kind of a complaint thing. How do you file complaints with the federal government? Well, there's a website out there that you can go and file a complaint, and I've got a link to that too. But reality is they're probably not going to do much for you. Where you should go is call your bank, call your credit card company immediately. Now, if the bad guys have already taken money out of your account, what you do is you also are going to have to file a police report with your local police department. Get that police report number because you might need it later on. A lot of times the banks, other financial institutions will require you to give the police report number because filing a false police report is a crime in and of itself. So they look at it and say, well, if you had filed something with the police department, it's probably true because under the law, you could be prosecuted and serve jail time if you file a false police report. So it's important to contact the bank, the credit card company, the financial institution, and then give a phone call to the local police or law enforcement agency that you might have. Now, when you are reporting a phishing scam, you want to include as much information as possible. So keep a copy of the email that you had responded to or the text message you received, whatever website that you visited, any personal information you may have entered. Put all of that in because they are going to need it. Now, I should point out, too, that you guys are the best and brightest, and you probably won't fall for one of these scams. You might, but I want you to know all of this stuff so you can help your friends. Because my friends come to me fairly frequently with these types of scams and these types of reports, so keep an eye out for that. So screenshots, if you have them, of the phishing email or the text message, you got to include those with your report. And if you have any information about the identity of the person or the group that sent the phishing email, make sure you include that with your report as well. So detecting a phishing attack is very important. I've got an article about that on my website as well. And I've got one about vishing, V-I-S-H-I-N-G, which is a voice phishing scam. And they are very problematic nowadays because voice scams are easy enough to generate. All they need is a few seconds of someone's voice. They can get that off of, TikTok and YouTube and all over the place. We're leaving our voices everywhere. And that can then be used to make a fake phone call or, some sort of a message that they're going to send to you. In fact, just this week, we had one of these types of scams, and there have been many in the past, but fake recording, fake voice scams are huge. There's a company, I think it was in the UK, that had been bought by a German firm, and the CEO of the UK company got a phone call from the head of the German company who told them they needed to pay this invoice for one of their suppliers, right? But it was fake. It was absolutely fake. And part of it's due to the whole generative AI stuff that's out there. But there are a lot of technologies that let you do it right now. People are already losing money from this. McAfee was saying 77% of victims in AI-enabled scams lost money. That's how good these scams are nowadays. And more than a third of those victims lost more than $1,000. It's a real problem. Original scam, here's one. Someone calls pretending to be the police, claiming a friend or family member needs money quick to get out of legal trouble. We mentioned that one already. Now, using AI, the scammer can actually pretend to be someone's child or other relative. They can get a very close facsimile of the real relative's voice without a whole lot of trouble. Legitimate tools are letting the scammers now respond in real time as they type out sentences in the voice cloning apps. I don't know if you watch American Idol, but was it Idol? America's Got Talent is actually, I think, what it was last year. And there were some guys that had a cloning app, really, program. They had a bunch of computers, a whole little rack that they brought with them. And they had a guy singing opera, and they had him up on a screen. Well, the big screen. And they made it look like it was, and sound like it was Simon Cowell who was singing. I think is who it was. And they've tried it with a few other people out there. So it's reasonable. I've talked before about the South Korean artist that was scammed out of something like $100,000 by Mark Garofalo. At least she thought she was talking to a Hollywood movie star who needed some extra money because, you know, he didn't make enough money off of those Marvel movies. And she got scammed. So be careful. It can happen to anyone. This technology is very easy to use. Our attacker doesn't have to have any expertise in artificial intelligence, and you can be scammed. So we keep your cockles up, okay? This is a problem. Make sure you get my email. You'll get this week's newsletter as well as future ones for free. CraigPeterson.com. I know, they're insider show notes. There was a vulnerability this week unlike any that I've seen before, and it's a lesson for each one of us. And it's very, very concerning because we're seeing new things all of the time. But, man, this 0 day is something else. You might be wondering what I mean by 0 day. A 0 day flaw is a flaw in a piece of computer hardware, software that is being exploited by a bad guy. But it's a flaw that there is not a patch for, usually because the manufacturer or developer of the software or hardware, usually because they do not have knowledge about the vulnerability. So some of these systems that are out there have had holes in them for years. There was just a recent one where it had been 8 years that this data was exposed. And that's definitely a 0 day because nobody knew about it. Well, there is always another reason to patch, isn't there? And patching can be good, it can be bad, it can certainly be a major pain for everybody involved because particularly with Microsoft Patch Tuesday, things can break. We just got a call this week from a client who all of a sudden their Google Chrome browser wasn't working and they needed to use Chrome for this one specific website because some websites are just coded up poorly, right? And it wouldn't work. Well, it turned out Microsoft Patch Tuesday had delivered a patch that caused problems with Chrome on her machine, as well as some others. So patches are important, and in fact, that's why I'm working on my Patch Aware product, so you know which patches matter, because we're talking about dozens of patches released daily sometimes. It's just overwhelming, frankly. Well, there was a patch that was released that fixed a problem called CVE 2023-2868. So that tells you something right there, because we're talking about these vulnerabilities for the year 2023, and this is vulnerability number 2,868 as of May 20th. That's when that one was released. Okay, that give you an idea of how many patches come out. Almost 3,000 by May 20, 2023. Well, this patch was installed by people, hopefully, for the Barracuda firewall. This is where things get just mind-blowing. Because we know, okay, so there's a vulnerability. Yeah, it's a 0 day. Yeah, we've had those before. Well, in this particular case, Barracuda is saying, if you have our email firewall, you need to replace it immediately. Full replacement. It is not patchable against this flaw. And this flaw apparently was exploited starting in October the year before. Wow, hey? So I've never heard this before, where a vendor is urging its customers to just wholesale rip out and replace, not patch these affected appliances. So they need to be replaced immediately, regardless of the patch version. So a lot of people are switching over. We've had some interest in our Cisco email filters, which we have and we use for our customers. But Barracuda knew that sort of thing was going to happen. So Barracuda is now telling you, if you are using their product and you've been happy with it, they will give you a new one for no charge. So that's a pretty big deal. The hard part about some of this is, okay, so how do I configure the new one? What happens while I'm waiting for the new one to arrive? What do I do in the meantime? What do I do with all of the emails that are coming in that might be compromised, right? This is always a problem. It doesn't matter who the vendor might be. Now, as of June 2023, Barracuda is saying that about 5% of their active email security gateway appliances have been hacked. And it's called an indicator of compromise due to the vulnerability. Rapid7, who's another cybersecurity company out there, called this stunning and said there appeared to be roughly 11,000 vulnerable email firewalls connected to the internet worldwide. So one of the things Rapid7 does is they kind of scan the internet and see how things respond so they know who it is. So if you have a Barracuda email firewall, get rid of it immediately, get a new one, or switch to something else, depending on what you want to do. But I've never heard about that before. Have you? But it brings up the whole issue of 0 days and the fact that we've got to be very careful, again, when we're applying patches. Because like this, what happened here with Barracuda, apparently it's being exploited since October, right? And they said as of May 20, I think it was, hey, you've got to replace it. So that's October to November, December, January, February, March, April, May. Are you counting along with me? That's 7 months. So when the patch comes out, it may be 0 day. The patch may just have come out. But that doesn't mean that it isn't urgent that you patch it. Because it's being exploited for 7 months. Exploited means the bad guys are using it. And with something like an email spam firewall, you got to figure that they are probably gaining access to the email. Doesn't that make sense? And one of the goals of malware is that it's hard to remove. The great little comment here by Nicholas Weaver. He's a researcher over at UC Berkeley. And this suggests, according to him, that the malware compromised the firmware itself to make it really hard to remove and very stealthy. That's not a ransomware actor. That's a state actor. In other words, that's somebody like a government, right? Whether it's North Korea or Russia or Iran, there's a lot out there. He says, why? Because a ransomware actor doesn't care about that level of access. They don't need it. If they're going for data extortion, it's more like a smash and grab. If they're going for data ransoming, they're encrypting the data itself, not the machines. So these machines were wanted by some state actors to have permanent access to email, is kind of the bottom line here. So what does that end up meaning? Well, again, think about, Hillary Clinton, right? Her email server that she had in her home. And it was not protected, and it was very hackable and likely hacked by the Russians and others, so they could gain access to all of her emails. Remember that whole thing? And then she deleted 30,000 emails that were under subpoena. She smashed, and her staff, I guess, smashed their smartphones to remove any trace. I don't know why they would do that when they're under subpoena. But anyways, what do you think would happen if other people are using something like a Barracuda firewall, email firewall, security appliance, and that security appliance isn't secure? What a great place for a country to be able to go take over the email servers, poke around and say, oh, wait a minute here. We've got another Hillary Clinton, right? And it might not just be Hillary, where they're looking for state secrets, but they're looking for you. And what are you doing? Who are you emailing? Are you passing bank account information? Is there some way that we can come after you? So we've got to be super careful and remember that just because the patch came out on Microsoft Patch Tuesday, or just because the patch came out today, it doesn't mean it's not urgent. And that's what Patch Aware, frankly, is all about. How urgent is it that you get something in place? I think that's absolutely huge. And remember, everything needs patches, including your little firewalls. All your servers. Are you patching them too? Well, what we could go by where I don't have something about artificial intelligence and electric cars. And this is kind of interesting because it's bringing back memories of Blu-ray versus HD DVD, or maybe Betamax versus VHS. You know, historically, we've allowed the market to decide who a winner should be. And if you're old enough to remember when videotape recorders first came out, the type with the cassettes, not the reel-to-reel ones, if you remember those, you will remember Sony Betamax and, of course, VHS. Now, Betamax was the superior format as far as the resolution went, and the tapes were a little bit tougher, the cassettes were smaller, all of that stuff was kind of advantageous, really, when you get right down to it. And we had VHS, which tended to kind of clog up a little bit more. The mechanism in the players wasn't quite the same as what Sony had made. And who won that game? Well, you don't see too many Betamax tapes laying around, do you? But there's still VHS tapes kicking around. VHS won that. Why did they win that? Well, they did not win it because it was the best technology. It was good. It was good enough, I think, is probably the better way to put it. That's why it won. And it had better marketing. Really, that's the reason it won. People caught on. It was easy. It was convenient. It was inexpensive versus the much more expensive Betamax recorders and players. And ultimately, obviously, the tapes themselves, if you bought a pre-recorded tape. So they won. And in that case, it's the bad guy one, right, if you will. They weren't bad guys. It was just the less technically advanced version of videotape one. Blu-ray versus HD DVD. Remember, we had DVDs. We still do. And DVD, the resolution is really good, especially if you've got a great player. The same thing's true with a lot of the streaming services. If you've got an Apple TV, wow, does it make even low-resolution streaming video look great. I love my little Apple TV box. But DVD didn't have the high-def that people wanted, right? People now want 4K, 6K, 8K in resolution. DVD didn't have that, so we had another battle. This was between two formats. Again, it was Blu-ray, which, as you probably know, won that battle, and HD DVD, which lost that battle. HD DVD was backwards compatible, had a whole bunch of really good things going for it. But again, the marketing won. Now we've got something entirely different when we're talking about electric vehicles. We have electric cars that are effectively completely mandated by the federal government in the U.S. These cars are being made using various rare earth elements, including copper, which is getting harder and harder to find and harder to mine. And it is very, very polluting, the manufacture of these. And then we've got the batteries after the fact. What are we going to do with them? California's taken some of the batteries out of the old cars. The batteries aren't good anymore and has been using them to make storage for electricity for wind farms. I saw an article that I really chuckled at, talking about the forest fires up in Canada. Not that the forest fires, that's a terrible thing. And Canada, like almost all of the U.S., has not been maintaining the forests properly. But massive fire. And so there's smoke coming over the eastern U.S., almost the entire eastern seaboard and other parts of the country. And these solar farms, this is the kind of the chuckle part, found that they lost more than 50% efficiency because of the smoke in the sky, right? It's just like a cloudy day, or in this case, a smoky day. So it's an interesting problem, but we don't have a competition going on. Toyota put their money behind hydrogen-powered cars because it makes a lot of sense. If you have cheap electricity and you can make that with nuclear power plants that are efficient and clean and will run off of the waste products from the old nuclear power plants for at least 100 years, probably 150 years here in the U.S., and they are intrinsically safe. So think what we could do if we turned up all of those power plants. They're reliable, aren't they? And then we can use that electricity to make hydrogen and have cars going down the street that the only output is water coming out the tailpipe. How's that for amazing? And Toyota has also done some work on combustion engines, internal combustion engines also that use hydrogen. Should that be the winner? I don't know. You don't know. We'll never know because the federal government is forcing it down a road, which makes you really think about what's going on here, who's making rich, right? Follow the money, all of that sort of stuff. Well, right now we have another battle going on. If you have an electric car, there's one thing you have to do. It's the same thing you have to do with a regular gas or diesel engine. You have to fill it up, don't you? Well, there are multiple standards, if you will. CCS is probably the biggest one in use by most of the various car manufacturers that are out there. This is the combined charging system. And if you have an electric car, you probably know exactly what that is. It looks like this CCS standard for charging cars might be like Toshiba's HD DVD, and it's heading to the ash heap of history. Okay, so CCS is type 1 or CCS1. It's used on practically every non-Tesla EV charging station in North America. So it's used everywhere. So why am I saying that it might be going the way of Betamax and HD DVD? Well, the reason is pretty simple. Ford announced that it has struck a deal with Tesla for Ford owners to be able to use Tesla's supercharger. Now, remember Tesla set up supercharging stations all the way from Portland, Maine, down to Los Angeles, California, all the way across the country, so that you can drive all that way with, give or take, 20-minute, 30-minute charges on their supercharging stations. So Ford announced that. They came up with a deal. Hopefully it'll last. I'm not sure. I haven't read the contract, obviously, but hopefully Tesla doesn't back out. Remember, Tesla had offered to all of the car manufacturers to be able to use their patent for the charging technology, and nobody took them up on it. So now Ford's taking them up on the charging stations. GM, not to be outdone, is a also-ran. GM has now announced that they are going to be providing their cars with the ability to use Tesla superchargers. Isn't that interesting? I think it's a great thing ultimately, particularly if the Tesla supercharger stays open. The problem I really have with these things is the amount of electricity that you need to run them. Huge power supplies. Some of these charging stations for these trucks now, these electric trucks, the big ones, have a megawatt. One of them even has 3 megawatt charging capabilities. That's a lot of electricity, and our grid is not set up for it. It's so obvious that the federal government is just trying to scare everybody and drive everyone into electric cars at the same time. So obvious. Because what we should be doing is build nuclear, quit shutting them down. I'm fine with the clean coal plants. I'm fine with the clean wood-burning plants. Let's eventually shut some of those down. But what we need is reliable electricity. We can't have what happened in Texas, where they almost lost. They were literally a few minutes away from losing the entire grid, power grid in Texas. That's how bad it got for them. That's huge. That's a huge problem. And we're going to have those types of problems too. Power grids are going to burn out. They're not designed to handle that kind of electrical load going everywhere. Yeah, they are for going to an industrial area that is using a lot of electricity, but not to residential areas. So we've got a huge problem. We don't produce enough electricity. Look at Germany now. They've been shutting down plants. Now they're turning some of them back on because they are way down. They're 20% down on their electric production. And remember, they're using all of the green stuff, and it's not meeting the country's needs. California, Gavin Newsom, the governor, quietly signed a bill that extended the license for nuclear power plant out there. Yeah, we need nuclear. So why don't we look at this, look at it logically, scientifically? Now, I'm a big believer in science, but science is where you observe something, you postulate as to why, you try and prove it or disprove it, and then move on, right? Because you've established something. Sir Isaac Newton, amazing man, supposedly saw the apple fall from the tree and started working on gravity. You know what? We still don't know exactly what gravity is. We know how the effects of gravity influence us, but we don't really know what it is. Well, look at what happened with the COVID-19 virus and how initially they were saying, oh, we've got a model and it's showing that we're going to lose 2.5 million people within the first few months in the United States alone. And of course, that didn't happen. Later on, people looked at the code from this researcher, and it's what we in the computer business call spaghetti code, a total mess, and it was totally wrong. And that's been true of the climate science for at least the last 40, 50 years. No questions about that. And there's lots of proof, easy to find online. So why don't we take this one step at a time? Let's produce electricity. Let's produce oil, sell it to the world, use some of those profits to make our grid better, stronger, and then start looking at, okay, how can we efficiently and effectively make electric vehicles and other things? Not the way we're doing it now. Hey, visit me online, craigpeterson.com. Lots of great information right on the website.